Thank you so much for that. And I do believe there's a bit of an ironic elephant in the living room here today, and that is that the climate crisis talk got moved onto Zoom and could no longer be held in person due to a climate event. So we'll all just pause with that information, take a few deep breaths. But we will be learning tonight some more about how to cope with our feelings related to this crisis. So let's just get started. I have a question for you guys, and that is, does anybody out there in Zoom land recognize this guy? Does anybody know who this is? So I bet we have a person or two in the audience that's more my age. Oh, good, I see a hand raised already. Abigail, would you like to share who this is and what you know about him?
So I never actually saw the ad because I was 25, because I'm 25, but I think I encountered this in an environmental history class, and I believe this is from the ad of that if you litter, it makes a Native American cry. And I don't want to get this wrong, but I think they discussed this guy is actually possibly Italian.
Yes.
And also, I'm not sure if I think it's this specific ad, but I'm not 100% sure. It's part of the corporate movement to make people feel individually responsible for pollution rather than blaming corporations for it. I think it was like Coca-Cola and some other big plastic polluters and other things that their products were being littered, and so they produced ads like this.
Wow, you are an encyclopedia of information about this guy. Thank you for that. You are correct. This is an iconic image that started appearing in the 70s. And I was about 10 years old, and you would see this everywhere. This guy was in newspapers, magazines, but you'd also see him on TV. And he was on this commercial where he was paddling a canoe across a lake. And he came across this scene of enormous environmental destruction, a lot of litter, and it was bad. And I remember seeing that. And, you know, in theory, he's a Native American. But he had a tear rolling down his cheek. And being a sensitive kid, I thought, wow, you know, pollution is a big deal. And this image literally stuck with me for decades. But time went on and I graduated from high school. And what you did in my high school when you graduated is they let you go back to your elementary school for a day, and you got to open your time capsule. And so I went back and I opened my time capsule, and in there was a letter from my little third or fourth grade self to my high school senior self. And that little girl asked me, will there still be pollution? We didn't have the term climate change then, but we did have the term pollution. And I think on some level, it was getting in me that this was kind of a big deal. And so how we treat the planet is a really big issue, maybe the biggest one we're ever going to face. But I grew up, and now it's 2006, and this movie came out by Al Gore called An Inconvenient Truth. Now, anyone here that knows me, and there are a few here, I think, knows that I'm kind of a more serious person. I like to learn things. I think truth is stranger than fiction, you know, so give me a good, you know, podcast or documentary or some nonfiction. You know, during COVID shutdown, I am like, everybody's watching Tiger King, and I'm like, ooh, what documentaries can I watch? And I was literally reading The Great Influenza of 1918, which is probably a really bad idea. But I was that same way in 2006. And when this movie came out, I said, literally, no, I'm not going to watch that. So why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you this because it's a good illustration of how, when we're psychologically overwhelmed by something that we actually do care about, we tend to go into denial. This happens not because we don't care, but because we care so much that's overwhelming. And when we do that and it comes to the climate crisis, that's a really big deal because it means we don't address it. So this story is one of three things that I want to talk to you about today. One is how our psychological overwhelm and denial are big things that have a big impact on the climate crisis. Number two, I'm going to talk about how the climate crisis impacts us. As a kid, even decades ago in the 70s, I felt sad and anxious. And now for our youth, all that's on steroids. And so we can say very clearly that mental health is being impacted. But I'm going to tell you three that even with a fairly substantial struggle with our emotions related to this crisis, if we work with those effectively, there is something called climate resilience that we can get to. And I'm going to tell you what that pathway looks like. Why does all this matter? Two reasons. One is we have a big crisis on our hands that we need to address. And two, because we care about mental health. So let's go back now and talk about that first thing, the issue of denial and how it is that we don't take action. Here's three ways. Here's three forms of denial. On the left, we have something called overt climate change denial. This is that thing you hear about where people say it's not real, it's not caused by humans, it's a hoax. And that's really kind of a bad thing. In fact, among industrialized nations, we have the highest rate of this. If there's something kind of good about this category, it is that it is rapidly declining. 73% of Americans now believe climate change is happening, and 68% are worried about it. So it's getting smaller. In the middle, we have plain old Marilee Feldman version denial that I just outlined for you. Also called negation, where we're kind of saying, I'm not going to look at whether or not this is happening. I have blinders on, two eyes, both are shut. And that seems really bad. But what's potentially a little bit positive about this form of denial is that, as with myself, it's temporary. So when the IPCC report came out 12 years and a few years ago that said we got about 12 years to deal with this thing, I could no longer maintain that denial, followed by a lot of upset feelings. We'll get to that. But the good news is that this form is because we care, and it tends to be temporary. This is a very large category of how the world is operating right now. On the right, we have something called disavowal, which is sort of the form of denial that has the capacity to say this is not that bad, to minimize it. It's like you have one eye shut and one eye open, and it's kind of for your convenience. You know climate change is a thing, but you'd rather just set that aside and go about business as usual. You don't want to be inconvenienced by this crisis, and maybe you don't care so much. This is really the most concerning form of denial that we have. Going back, though, that middle category is a lot of people, and that has to do with psychological overwhelm, fear, and anxiety. So we have a lot that we can do. It's been said by Gabor Mate, a famous Canadian physician who talks very eloquently about psychological matters. He said, addressing global climate change begins with attending to the climate within. So let's take a look at how that climate within is impacting things. So on the left, I believe, is where we're at, and on the right is where I think we need to go. On the left at the top, we have a lot of anxiety and overwhelm, and this is in fact what we do have. And as we just saw, we go into a denial state, which is what we do. And then the result is that we kind of all act like nothing's going on here, and we don't talk about it, and nobody does anything. Okay. Now, I have a question for y'all. On this issue of whether or not we're talking about it, and I realize in our audience today, we have a number of climate activists. You guys probably talk about climate change with each other a fair amount. I want you to set aside the conversations that you have with other climate activists and think about talking to neighbors, talking to coworkers, talking to people that you don't know so well, or friends. How often do you talk about the climate crisis? So I'd like to see if there's somebody that would maybe use their hand raise emoji and perhaps share a story of what happens when you try to talk in your general environment about this issue. Would anybody like to share? And great. Alrighty, we have Eddie. Eddie, would you like to share?
Yeah, sure. What I've noticed is that, at least in other conversations I have, people typically are like, yeah, that's really bad. And then it kind of just ends at that. There's no real discussion of like, well, what can we do? And how do the decisions made in this, who is it benefiting? Who is it hurting? And who do we need to talk to in order for that to change? It's kind of just like, it's not necessarily like denial or like, uh, it's not necessarily denial, but it's kind of excusing it. Like you're acknowledging it and then you're kind of just letting it drop off. I've
Yeah,
noticed that like in every conversation, there's just kind of like an awkward, like 15-second pause afterwards. And then we like talk about something else.
yeah. The awkward pause phase. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that that's really common. Let's get off the subject really fast. You're making me uncomfortable, sort of a message. Okay. Who else? Rich, would you like to share?
Yeah, a couple things. I agree with Eddie. Same thing, that kind of awkward pause and just hoping that I'll shut up. I also see this kind of like dismissal politically, right? Like, so if I'm talking to like a lot of my family or happen to be conservative, and they kind of, will just say I'll mention some facts about climate change or some things that have been happening lately, and a way to engage them, and they'll just, like, my mom's famous for just going, "Oh, that Al Gore," right? Like, as somehow, it climate change is all, it's all liberal, and therefore it can be dismissed. The wind turbine is liberal and it can be dismissed. And then with other people, it's just like this kind of, I got I got too much to deal with. I can't be thinking about this, or it's that older mentality. I think it's kind of fading out, that it's not going to happen until I'm long dead, 500 years from now, so just different ways of just kind of pushing it away.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So you're kind of outlining a couple things that we saw here. One is overt climate change denial. Others are psychologically overwhelmed. Yeah. So, and I wish we could accept all the people that want to speak now. We won't have time, but thank you so much. Um, so there's kind of like this unwritten rule in our society that this is so big and so depressing that we're just not going to talk about it. And if you do, there is that awkward pause. And then what happens, at least in my own experiences, it has something to do with you. You're kind of being a Debbie Downer right now. You must have anxiety. Why are you so worried about this? So there's these unwritten rules. We're kind of not allowed in our culture to talk openly about probably the single biggest thing we're facing. Well, let's talk now about what would happen, what it would look like if we could all start talking. Okay, that's on the right. We all start talking. I would suggest as a therapist that what would happen is we'd find out, oh, you feel the same way. That would help us. We might find our level of distress starts to go down. We can handle these conversations. We become more resilient about them. And then we're more likely to take action. So I'm inviting everyone here to just find ways to bring this up as often as you can in casual conversation. For example, when someone now says to me, oh my God, it's so hot out, I usually don't just commiserate with the inconvenience of the heat. I usually say, it really is. And it's worrisome, isn't it? Because I want the connection drawn between the inconvenience of heat and the awareness that something is really important happening. We also, as we talk to others, find out where are our allies on this issue and who's going to support us. And that's how we begin to address this crisis more effectively. So let's talk a little bit about the data. What data do we have about how this crisis is impacting our mental health? Well, the Yale Center on Climate Change Communication, great organization. I hope everyone will follow them, get their newsletter. They did say, study this and find out, as I shared, 73% of Americans think climate change is happening, 68% are worried about it, 34% are alarmed. That's a lot of distress, and that number has tripled in the last decade. In the medical journal, The Lancet, which is a very prestigious medical journal, in 2021, there was a study of youth across the globe in 10 countries, and they found that nearly 60% of youth are extremely worried about this crisis. 75% say the future is frightening. 39%, this is where I get goosebumps every time I say this, say they hesitate to have children because the future is so scary to them. They also learned that youth very much feel betrayed by the adults. 65% saying that they believe the government has failed them and they don't trust that the government will take effective action on this problem. They experience something called moral outrage, which is a particular type of anger around an injustice. And it's a particularly painful one because they view this crisis as preventable and therefore it is senseless. That is a particularly hard type of anger to handle. 11%, a minority but a substantial one, say that it's too late to do anything and they perceive that they have no future and that humanity is doomed. I find this interesting too. This was true for me. When I was in grade school, I was taught about pollution. Youth now are taught left and right about climate change, but they're not particularly asked to share their feelings about it or taught how to cope with it. Let's talk for a second about who is impacted from a mental health perspective and when. As we are seeing, youth are facing the most impacts in their lifetime, and so they are most worried about this. On the basis of race and income, white affluent people have suffered the least and are only just now starting to wake up to this crisis. People from marginalized communities and minorities have been the most impacted, and they've been dealing with this for decades. On the basis of geography, the global South is living this every single day. In Chicago, I would suggest that we have been less impacted than many areas within our own country, and we are in a pretty huge state of denial compared to other areas, such as California with the wildfires, such as Hawaii. I was hoping that when we had the extreme poor air quality, I sent out press releases everywhere. I was hoping that would capture Chicago's attention, but it did not. So let's talk specifically about what are the mental health impacts of this crisis. And first of all, why do we develop mental health symptoms? Well, it's because this crisis is posing a lot of increased stress to us, as well as increased uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. And anytime we have more stress, and definitely when we have more uncertainty, our brains do not like that. They want to know what's going to happen. And so whatever the problem is, if it's you're wondering if your boss is mad at you or you're going to run out of money, the minute you think about uncertainty, your anxiety will in fact go up, no matter what the problem, no matter who you are. Okay, so climate change is producing a lot of uncertainty, a lot of stress, and no one is talking about it. This is a recipe for a lot of problems. The first one, the biggest one, the one that you hear about the most is anxiety, which comes out in the form of a lot of worry about how's this going to be, what's going to happen, what do I need to be doing? A lot of plain fear. And if you suffered an extreme weather event or a climate event, PTSD is common. And that means that you get a trigger in your world that reminds you of a traumatic event, and you get a lot of physiologic hyperactivation. Your heart is racing, sort of like a panic attack. You try to avoid anything that reminds you. You may have insomnia, nightmares, a lot of anxiety. That's PTSD. But now in my field of understanding climate change and mental health, we're starting to hear this term pre-traumatic stress disorder, which is all of the symptoms of PTSD, only there's no past event. It's just brought on by images or thoughts of what's going to happen in the future. We also know that climate change can impact our mood and cause a depressed mood, just plain full out depression on its own, or because the anxiety is getting so bad. And we're also seeing something called eco grief, which is a sense of loss about the future. You're kind of mourning the world that you know, because it seems like it's disappearing and it's changing. You're finding out, you know, the world is more tragic and life is more fragile than I previously thought. There's loss of ecosystems, loss of nature. And then we also have something called existential dread, which is kind of like having a gray cloud over your head that you walk around with a lot, dreading what's coming in the future. You're not sure what's wrong. You're not sure what's going to happen, but it seems like things are flying apart and it can't be good. So there's this sense of dread. We also see changed mental health related behavior. So if you have enough anxiety for a while or enough low mood for a while, those are really unpleasant. And you might want to try to take the edge off those things. Great way to do that would be to drink more, use more substances. So we see an increase in addiction with extreme heat events. Right now, we tend to see more aggressive behavior, potentially more child abuse. And if all this goes on long enough, an increase in suicidal thinking as well as suicide itself. This all builds sort of quietly and slowly. It's kind of like that lobster. If you put them in a pot of room temperature water and raise the temperature, it doesn't know it should get out. So there's a slow build of symptoms that start to break through. And when we get through that period of denial, we can get overwhelmed with a lot of feelings. And this is what I would call a climate awakening, which is what happened to me a few years ago with the IPCC report. This also happened to our climate activist, Greta Thunberg, who went through a lot of depression and anxiety when her denial just fell apart. But on the other side of this is acceptance, understanding, you know, we're moving from this is not happening or this can't happen. By the way, sometimes activists are like, I got to stop this thing, right? Which is a little bit of a denial state because you can't. And we'll talk more about activists in a minute. But some more acceptance of the reality of exactly what is happening in a way that feels tolerable and increased coping and resilience. If you want to do some reading about mental health and climate change, there's many books. You could read a lot of them. I don't advise you do that. But the one that I like best is called Generation Dread by Britt Ray. This book is focused on how this crisis is impacting youth, but it's super useful for anyone of any age. She's a very eloquent writer, and she says, the emotional journey that comes with facing up to the environmental crisis can be very intense, disturbing, and emotionally painful. So it's really important that we understand, for some people, not big, other people, this awakening is just huge. This is a range of feelings that people might experience as they go through this. And Britt Ray says, the ability to create a more just and healthy world depends largely on how well these feelings are attended to. So we're going to talk now about some of those feelings and what they would sound like if you said them to yourself or you heard them from another person. And I thought we were not going to be just on Zoom and I was going to have you all raise your hands, and now I won't be able to see you. But you can still raise your hand in the privacy of your very own home if you have found yourself saying any of these things, and you can leave it up or you can put it down. But imagine others on Zoom here feeling these things and raising their hand, because it's going to be a lot. Anxiety looks like this. Where will I live? Do I need to move? Could that happen here? When will it get bad? What will it be like? How will this impact my kids? And we have a question. And I might add, by the way, we will try to be interactive. We may go a little over on time. That's okay with me. Anybody that needs to leave on time, welcome to do that. So Abigail, would you like to share?
Sorry, I thought you were asking us to raise our hands if we thought any of those things applied
God.
to
Hey,
us.
we got one out there that raised their hand, but yeah, okay. I bet there's a bunch of you. All right. Let's talk about what guilt looks like. It's said that we're all climate hypocrites now. As much as we all aspire to want to have solar panels, recycle, not have a large carbon footprint, we can't pull that off. And so some people with ecological distress feel guilty all day long. See if you relate to any of this. I should have acted sooner. Hello, me. I'm buying all this plastic. I'm using all this gas. I shouldn't be flying. I have it easy compared to the people in Hawaii, the people in California. Guilt. Rage looks like this. Why is no one paying attention to this issue? My personal favorite, hearing others express inconvenience about the heat, the air quality, and not making the connection of that to climate change. Wondering why is everyone out on the weekend buying all this stuff, flying, shopping, focused on celebrity culture. This could have been prevented. Hopelessness sounds like a lot of certainty, and we'll talk about that more in a bit, such as, I'm certain the world is ending. It's too late to do anything. My actions don't matter. And I would suggest that this needs to be addressed because we truly don't know what's going to happen. No one knows for sure. Grief and sadness look like this. I can't go outside and I want to. It's different. It's too hot. It's changing. We call that solastalgia, meaning a sense of loss or nostalgia about how things used to be compared to how they're getting to be, how they are now. My children won't be living the life I thought because of climate change. Or in youth, what is the point of going to college, advancing my career, because the world won't be around for that. Let's talk a little bit more generally about this term climate anxiety. Notice that I put it in quotes. I did that for a reason. And that is because when we say anxiety, it kind of focuses on the individual. It kind of suggests there's something going on with you. Okay? But as we learned before, there's a very external danger in our world that's posing a lot of uncertainty, and we can't help but for our anxiety to go up in response to that. So, climate anxiety is not a mental disorder. It's a reasonable reaction to an external danger. And it would be better called eco-distress, but an even better term would be climate compassion. And I say that because working with people with a lot of anxiety, one of the things that happens is when we have a lot of feeling, we tend to shame ourselves and say, why am I so anxious? Nobody else seems this anxious. It must be me. Okay. But I point out to them, maybe it's because you care so much that you're having all this anxiety. Maybe that's why I was so upset as a little kid, because I cared a lot. So it could better be called climate compassion. In speaking about the normalcy of this anxiety, Britt Ray, our author, said this: it is reasonable to be worried. It is appropriate to grieve. It is logical to be scared. It is humane to be gutted. It is fitting to freak out. It is decent to rage. So I'm going to pause there. That was a lot. And see if there are any questions. Take a couple questions, or anybody that would like to share perhaps how you relate to what we're talking about here. And a lot of you have your hands raised, I think. If you don't have a question, lower that. But if you do have a question, raise that hand back up and we'll bring you in. Okay, Abigail, you're back. Hi.
Hi, maybe you're going to focus on this later in the talk, but I have a social science background that I'm currently working on a project on the relationship between climate anxiety and like activist mobilization. Is that something you're going to get into later, or?
Yeah, so you're onto something really important, and research has shown that people with more climate anxiety are more likely to be engaged with the problem, i.e. becoming an activist, becoming politically active. That has its own risk of burnout because we care. So there's a cost of caring sort of phenomenon. And we'll talk a little bit about burnout, but you're absolutely right. It is a really good strategy to be able to say, I am worried about this, but I am at least doing something with those feelings. I'm taking action, and that makes us feel better, right? So really important topic. Love that you're.
I'll probably send you an email after the talk asking for a bunch of articles and stuff.
I got them. All right. And I will be putting my email up at the end. Okay.
Great.
And then we have not Abigail, but we have Abby. Abby, would you like to go?
Yeah, I guess it's just relating to this quote that you have on the screen. Something that I think I feel heaviest about, and both like heavy grief about, but also a lot of rage, is like our like separation from the land, I think, and our relationship of being so separated from the land, especially living in such an urban area. And I'm lucky, like I live up in like Ravenswood area, and so I have a lot of green spaces around me, but even then I think it's just feeling so frustrated when it feels so good, to be outside, to be with the nature preserves and be able to walk around, or to be able to travel and go hike and backpack, but then to be also inundated with like images and news and stories about like continual extraction going on. And I don't know, it's kind of hard to put into words, but I feel a lot of grief of like such a severed relationship. And I think a lot of isolation of, wanting to rebuild a relationship with the land, but not everyone, around me necessarily wants to do that.
And gosh, I so relate to what you're saying, because it's in those moments of real joy of being in nature that some people are saying that is also just bittersweet, because I go around and I think it's all about to disappear, or how come nobody cares? So the most wonderful things about nature that we think might really nurture and sustain us also become pain points, is I think part of maybe what you're saying. You become more aware of all that we're not doing. Did I kind of get that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. We're gonna keep moving. There will be more time for questions.
Marilee, I saw Eddie had a hand up as well.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Eddie, go ahead. Eddie, are you there? I think his hand is just up and.
Oh, okay. I'll lower all hands for now.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So when do we kind of move off from having a lot of upset feelings to potentially having an actual mental health issue? How do we know when it's time maybe to seek some help for this climate anxiety or eco distress? And the things would be, if we're worrying a lot, and a lot would be numerous hours during the day, all day long, we're starting to have impacts on our functioning, meaning if we're a student, we can no longer study and concentrate. We can't get up in the morning and go to work. We're unable to do the basics such as eat or sleep. And this one's really important. It's robbing us of our enjoyment of life. The anxiety or low mood is getting so great that we don't have any enjoyment anymore. And believe me when I tell you, that won't help you help climate change to feel that way. So this is not serving a purpose. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the unique challenges of climate activists, and that can include climate scientists and climate educators and climate journalists. And that's really about the fact that y'all are swimming in this. Y'all are very educated, y'all are taking action, doing all the things. But that means that you're frequently dealing with the emotions that we've been talking about. You feel angry, you feel sad, hopeless, you're grieving. You're frustrated by the lack of attention put on the climate crisis. Notice I don't call it climate change. That change is such an innocuous word. It's a crisis, it's an emergency, it's not just change. You're frustrated by the failure for progress to be made, the progress that you're working toward. You're acutely aware of the degree of loss and destruction going on, whereas it seems many are not. You're constantly exposed to others who are far less bothered by this than they should be. And then because of that not talking thing, you're kind of judged for your concern. So you end up frequently feeling maybe a little lonely in this whole process or alienated from other people. It's like a solitary battle, it feels at times. And what this means is you're at very high risk for burnout. And what I'll say is we need you guys. In fact, we need you, and we need you to need you. We need you to continue to care about the world and to continue to care about yourselves. You guys are the changers who have the potential to shape the future of our world. And so it's very hard because there's this urgency that makes you want to get in there and keep working, keep fighting, keep doing it. And it is very hard for people that are inundated with all this information to stop moving and stop taking action. But this work should not suck you dry. You need to recharge in order to think creatively and be as effective as you need to be. That's going to be a lot of work on your part to make sure you force yourself to rest and take breaks and feel supported so that you can feel hopeful and inspired and think creatively. Okay. If you do this hard work that we're talking about, you can find yourself having this climate awakening. It's really painful, but we want to get you to this thing we're talking about called climate resilience. That's actually possible. I used to be a mess. I'm less of a mess. Here I am. And we can say that there's clear phases to this thing called climate resilience, and that's getting past that denial. We already talked about that. Number 2 is accepting the size of and the reality of the loss. If someone in your life passes away, it's very similar. You have to come to terms with how big this is, how your life's going to change. 3 is you have to grasp the timeline. You're not only working on how big this is, when is it? Some people do think it's decades from now, but that's really not true. And then we're working through all these feelings that this whole thing has brought up, and that's a lot of work. But when we do that, we kind of adjust to this new world by taking on new skills, new aspects of our identity, and doing new things. We say, now that I understand this thing, how am I going to be in this world? Sorting through all this involves dealing with these 4 things, and that would be our feelings, our thoughts, looking at our behaviors, as well as our body sensations, because we know that the climate crisis gets to the point at times where it is what we call a collective trauma. And what we know about trauma is that it impacts our nervous system. And so we have to be able to regulate our nervous system. When it comes to feelings, the single most important thing we can do is talk about our feelings. In my field, we have a phrase called name it to tame it. And that means as we're talking, we put words or labels, feeling words on what we're experiencing. I feel despair. I feel this is agonizing. And as we put words on those feelings, it actually gives us a little space from them. And then it starts to feel like the emotions aren't running the show so much. We have a little distance. It also decreases our sense of isolation. If someone talks with us about our feelings, and understands us, we feel like I'm not alone so much, and we're less likely to be ashamed of our feelings. It's also empowering to understand our feelings, because feelings are our guide to getting our needs met. If I feel sad, maybe that means I need to go do something. So it's empowering. It gives us a sense of direction. And then as we talk about our feelings too, we start to recognize, I have cycles of this stuff that I go through. One day I'm in enormous despair, and then the next day I'm better and I feel like I can handle it. So it's normal to have those cycles. We start to become familiar with it. None of this happens when we're in denial. But then we also discover I can hold two very different things at once. I can feel both powerless and hopeless, and also have a little bit of hope that maybe there's something I can do here and take some action. I can be enraged at all that's going on and feel some gratitude for what I have. Where do we go with all these feelings? There's many sources of support really for climate-related feelings, one being something called the Good Grief Network, which you can find online. That is communities of people that join online to talk about their feelings according to their 10-step program. It's a lot of what we're talking about here, and it's fabulous. If you want something shorter, there are things called climate cafes, and Climate Psychology Alliance, which I'm involved with, holds these. You can do these online. In Chicago in September, there's going to be one in person at Skunk Cabbage Books. I may be there. If you're interested in that, just email me later and I can tell you about that. But that is a really cool, basically 1 evening, hour and a half experience. It's kind of like, there's a lot of upset feelings, but there's a lot of healing that you walk out with. If you're really struggling a lot, you may want to get help in terms of therapy. Climate Psychology Alliance also has a list of climate-aware therapists. This is actually pretty important. The last thing you want if you seek help is a therapist that does not understand the enormity of the problem, doesn't understand the timeline, has not done their own interior emotional work on this problem, or says something like, well, how realistic is that? They just don't get it. That is going to be really invalidating, and that's not something you need. So you can find these lists online. And then we really shouldn't minimize the importance of activists and community group peers. I'm involved with a local group of therapists through Climate Psychology Alliance, and that's been just enormously healing. They are like my best friends while we all go through this together. So relying on each other, even within 350.org, we can't minimize how important that is. When it comes to our thoughts, it's really important to watch out for black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, doomerism, developing some flexibility in our thinking, watching for when we think we know for sure, that certainty thing we touched on. If we're worrying a lot, I know it may be hard to realize, but we sometimes think worrying is something that just happens to us. It's not. It's something that we've kind of learned how to do. It's something that we can have some degree of control over. And there are ways to disengage from worry. Sometimes when we worry, we think we're solving a problem, but we're not. We're just worrying. We're just getting over it over and over, and it's actually raising our anxiety. It's not solving any problem. And so there are things called disengagement strategies that you can learn so that you don't do that all day long. We need to let go of that harsh inner environmental critic, that voice of guilt that we talked about. And then watching our narrative. If you're telling a story of great catastrophe all day, every day, it might be worth learning that there could be a story of great hope here as well. If you've ever experienced a personal crisis, you know that some of the most painful times in your life have also led to the greatest growth. And so there is a term in my field now related to this issue called post-traumatic growth. And so something new and better could be coming. And I don't mean to present overly positive false hope. But, our culture is not perfect. We're pretty disconnected. We're pretty materialistic. There's a lot that's not quite great. Maybe through this crisis, we'll start to figure out what's more important. It's also important to take a look, if you're really struggling, at having healthy behavioral coping strategies. And those would be basics of self-care. You wouldn't believe how quickly these things start to disappear when somebody's really struggling. Sleep, diet, and exercise, enormously important. And then simple behavioral strategies such as mindful awareness of the present moment, mindfulness regarding what it is our brain is thinking, journaling, and then that behavioral engagement, taking action on this crisis. And I will say too that it's important to take collective action. Individual action is important, such as solar panels, electric vehicle, whatever it is you want to do, recycling. But what's really helpful is collective action. So being involved with a group such as 350.org, because it gives you community. And also collective action is what it's going to take to influence the government and for us to really change the trajectory of this crisis. As you've probably heard, individual action is not going to be enough. Limiting exposure to negative news is really important. We all want to be well informed, but when we are activists, when we are climate aware therapists, there's got to be a limit to the degree to which we inform ourselves, because we also need to stay sane. Okay. This thing that you're looking at here is called the window of tolerance. I will spend not enough time on it, but the idea here is that this crisis is a trauma. It is causing our nervous systems to get dysregulated, meaning that we can go into that top zone there called the zone of hyperarousal, which basically means our nervous system is in fight or flight mode, heart beating fast, can't breathe, muscle tension, a lot of anxiety. And here's the thing to know. When our nervous system is not regulated, we can't think our way out of it, but boy, we sure try. We think, I got to think differently about this, or we try to figure it out. But that will not work, because it's a one-way directional system. This thing in our brain called the amygdala is firing, and it does not listen to our higher cortex. The only way to calm this down is to learn to work with our bodies. And as simple as it sounds, that may mean diaphragmatic breathing, grounding strategies, going for a walk. You cannot think your way out of this. It needs to be bottom up kind of work. There's other zones here, but what we're shooting for is that one in the middle, the zone of the window of tolerance, okay, where we feel regulated. The one on the bottom is we spend enough in hyperactivated mode, we're going to end up kind of flat lying, laying on the couch, okay, depressed. Okay, so let's talk about, if we do all this work, deal with the feelings, thoughts, behaviors, and sensations, what would climate resilience look like? It would look like spiritual growth, meaning we might find greater meaning and purpose in our lives. We might figure out what matters most to us. We might find deeper connection with others in our communities and with nature. We might find an increased gratitude and appreciation for life. And then we might take all the energy that we put in to all of this anxiety, all of this grief, all of this upset feeling. That's a lot of energy. And we might turn that into love and action and caring. So as it turns out, if you're having a climate crisis, this can actually turn into a really positive and motivating thing for you. And last, I'd like to just say, and this is a really huge point that we need a whole hour on, but climate resilience occurs in community. They've studied children who have experienced an extreme weather event. And in communities where that happens and the child feels very supported, in a very strong community where people are talking about what's happening, those kids are going to have lower rates of PTSD than kids that experience the exact same thing in a very disconnected community. They will have much higher rates of PTSD. So anything that you can do to increase your sense of connection and the connections within a community and working together, that's going to go miles in helping our resilience to this crisis. Bill McKibben, our very important climate activist, said this: the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. I love that quote. If we had to quickly summarize, how do you cope with climate anxiety? I want it in one place for y'all. Talk openly about your feelings. Allow them, don't push them away. We know that that does not work. Seeking support, perhaps from a professional or a support group. Learning strategies to decrease unproductive worry. Be informed, but limit your exposure to negative news. Practice good self-care, take breaks, find enjoyment, allow that, and then learn to manage your window of tolerance and regulate your nervous system, watching that narrative, focusing on post-traumatic growth and possibility. I'd like to leave you with this thought, and I'll just read this out loud. Emotions drive our actions. In the face of the overwhelming stress, grief, and loss created by climate change, how we deal with our feelings will determine whether we find the strength and conviction needed to make the changes required to save the planet and ourselves. Thank you so much. That is my talk. Here is how you reach me, and I'll open things up for questions.
I just want to start by saying thank you very much, Marilee. This was an excellent presentation. I've already gotten some private feedback in the chat that people were very pleased with this and excited to see the topic being brought forth and learned a lot. So thank you so much.
You are welcome.
Yeah, and to kind of get things started, I just wanted to share the last few slides, on climate resiliency and community really struck home with me because I was having anxiety, despair, hopelessness 10 years ago, and that is what drove me to now launch 350 Chicago. And since then, we've gotten the city of Chicago to divest its operational budget from fossil fuels. And so just wanted to share that taking action and turning that despair into hope and action is fruitful. So
Phenomenal. I love that story. Thank you so much. Wow. Yeah, and I realized I took my email down, so I'll just put that in the chat. I can figure that out. Okay. Who else has a question? Just use your raise hand emoji.
Hey, yeah, thank you so much, Marilee. That was terrific. I mentioned to you earlier in email. I'm so sorry that we couldn't meet in person. I was so looking forward to it. Zoom is such a great tool, but boy, since we've all been on it for 3 years, I really look forward to having more and more events in person. So I think we just do this again in 6 months, and
Okay.
hopefully we don't have a blizzard stopping us. But I was just the way I always think of it. Uh, you know, I knew about things and climate change and stuff when I was a little bit younger, but I didn't really do much. I was certainly doing the denial thing, and a lot of me was thinking like, yeah, but oh, doctors always say, if you eat a candy bar, you're gonna die. But they always exaggerate these things, that kind of thing. And but I just kind of knew. I knew what I was doing. I was just kind of like,
Yeah.
if I go there, it's gonna be too upsetting. But then I had children, and I couldn't look away, and so then I just started just studying, and my daughter's 17 now, and it's been 17 years, and I just read studies every day, and I just think about that, and I think about all of us that have children, and even, my nieces and nephews and grandnieces and nephews, and I think about leaders in Congress, leaders in the General Assembly, who aren't acting, and I think about specifically like those people who are in power and at ExxonMobil in particular. Um, they have children, they have grandchildren. These are smart people. They have had the science for decades, that particular company, and it's just I just can't fathom, you know what I mean? Like it just is it just they're that greedy, they're willing to sell everything, right? I mean, I know that this might seem off topic, but I'm just wondering if you have a comment on that.
I certainly can relate to it. It's like so foreign to me as well that I completely
Mhm.
understand where you're coming from. That is that moral outrage that we talked about it, and I don't know that there's a simple solution to it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because the one thing I just think about is, you could be greedy and do terrible things in business to make more money or and do these different things. But if you're what you're doing directly to keep the fossil fuel era going is directly hurting your family. You know what I mean? It's just like,
Right. We could almost understand it if they didn't also have children, but they do. So what do
yeah,
we make of that? I
yeah,
got
yeah.
you.
I gotta ask one of them one day. I gotta figure out a way. But thanks again.
Yeah. And then we have a question from Laura.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for this presentation. Somebody not in the psychology field, it was really helpful to like just see the language and understand, like you said, how to name some of these things that I've been experiencing. So I really appreciate it. There was a slide towards the end where you mentioned something about like a window of
Yes.
something. I wasn't able to catch it, but can you explain a little bit more about what that is? Like one of the strategies for mitigating?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a very well-known diagram in the field of trauma therapy. And so trauma is getting a lot of attention and interest as it should. We did not used to know that things that are traumatic, meaning they're overwhelming us, they are too much for what we feel we have the capacity to handle. That impacts us, not just our brain, it impacts our body. There's a famous book that you can get called The Body Keeps the Score, meaning it doesn't really matter how much thinking you do about a past traumatic event, because you cannot talk your way out of things that have basically, the energy of a trauma is stored in the body, meaning that it lives there in the form of energy. And so that diagram is showing you there's a zone of comfort, a window of tolerance where we feel like our nervous system is regulated and our heart rate's normal and we can socialize with people and we're good, right? But when we're traumatized, a lot of times we are triggered into a memory, and then it's literally our body that's having a reaction. You don't get to have a choice about that. It just happens in your body. And so you go into that zone of hyperactivation. That's the top area. If you spend enough excessive amount of time there, you will kind of flatline and go into the bottom area, which is the zone of hypoarousal. And then you will be very depleted, laying on the couch, kind of depressed. Like I said before, you cannot really talk your way out of those states. You have to learn to manage, work with your body and get your body so that it's calming down or getting a little bit more energy if you're at the bottom. But you can find that anywhere online by Googling window of tolerance and learn more about it. Does that help?
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. And Jeff has a question.
I do. Thank you so much again for your contributions tonight and sharing your experience with us. You talked a lot about what you could do as an individual to move yourself through some of the grief, anxiety that many of us are feeling. What would your thoughts be to help somebody that you love, somebody that you may have even helped contribute some of the climate compassion, and you see them struggling? What are some thoughts in terms of helping those around you?
Well, that's such a good question. If someone is struggling with climate related fears or emotions, I would say the single most important thing you can do is not rush them through that conversation, because that tends to happen a lot. Parents, in particular, if a child expresses a fear, want to say things like, oh, it's going to be okay, when really the single most important thing you can do is, be encouraging them to express their feelings, validate their feelings, say, it is a little scary right now. If I were you, I'd be scared too. That seems upsetting, right? And so you're validating feelings, as well as just plain listening and being very encouraging. So you're doing this thing that you've probably heard more recently, gets a term thrown around a lot called creating space. That's the thing that makes people calm down more than anything, is the ability to express those feelings, to have them be validated, they feel heard. That is really healing. When I do a climate cafe, people come in, they talk about all their upset feelings, but nothing changes. We haven't fixed the climate crisis, but they walk out and they're like, wow, that was really cool. I feel better, because they've been heard, they've shared, and they feel connected. So those are the things that are most going to be helpful. Does that help?
It does. Thank you. Very insightful.
Okay. All right. Okay. I guess that's it. I really, really, value you guys being here and your attention to this problem. You are the most important people in the world right now. So thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure for me.